There are some silences so deep they feel like drowning. What I didn't know was that even in the quietest places of grief, heaven was still listening. If you've ever lost something so precious that words became impossible, this story will show you that God hears what we cannot say. Comment presence if you need to know He's still there, even in the silence. I'm about to share the day my voice disappeared, not because my throat was damaged, but because my heart was shattered, and how I discovered that sometimes our deepest prayers have no words at all. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. Romans 8:26. The silence in room 247 was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It wasn't supposed to be silent. This room was supposed to be filled with crying, the beautiful, chaotic crying of new life. Instead, it held only the hollow echo of machines that had been disconnected, monitors that no longer beeped, and the devastating quiet that follows when a heart stops beating before it's had a chance to truly live. The empty cradle sat beside my hospital bed like an accusation, its soft yellow blankets still folded perfectly, waiting for arms that would never fill it. I stared at it until my eyes burned, but no tears came. Even my body seemed to understand that some pain was too deep for the ordinary language of grief. I was supposed to leave this hospital as a mother. Instead, I left as a woman who had forgotten how to speak to God. 12 hours earlier, everything had been different. 12 hours earlier, I'd been counting contractions and texting my sister excited updates. "This is it. Can't wait for you to meet your nephew." 12 hours earlier, I'd been praying Thanksgiving prayers, overwhelmed by the miracle that was about to enter the world. Now I couldn't remember how to form words that went upward. The labor had been long but normal, nothing the doctors were concerned about, nothing that suggested the universe was about to shatter into pieces I'd never be able to put back together. I'd held David's hand through each wave of pain, breathing through contractions while we talked about names and college funds and whether our son would have his father's eyes or mine. "You're doing so well," the nurse had said during transition, her voice warm with the kind of encouragement that made you believe everything was going according to plan. "He's going to be here soon." He was here soon, for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. If you've ever held joy and devastation in the same moment, you'll understand what I'm about to share. I remember the first cry, that piercing, perfect sound that announced his arrival to the world. I remember David's tears, the way his face transformed with wonder as he watched our son take his first breaths. I remember the overwhelming rush of love that flooded through me, so powerful it felt like it might stop my own heart. "He's beautiful," the doctor said, placing him on my chest. "Absolutely perfect." And he was. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, dark hair that swirled in a perfect cowlick just like his father's, eyes that opened for just a moment, looking directly at me as if he knew exactly who I was, as if he'd been waiting his whole short life to see my face. "Hello, Samuel," I whispered, my voice breaking with joy. "I'm your mama." Those were the last words I would speak with complete faith for the next 2 years. I'm going to tell you about the moment I learned that love and loss can happen in the same heartbeat, and how that broke something in me I didn't know could be repaired. The change happened so quickly that my mind couldn't process it at first. One moment, Samuel was warm and perfect against my chest, making those soft newborn sounds that seemed to come from heaven itself. The next moment, those sounds stopped. "Something's wrong," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I was hoping I was being paranoid, hoping the sudden stillness was just him settling into sleep. But the nurses knew immediately. I could see it in their faces, the way their expressions shifted from routine to urgent, the way their movements became quick and purposeful. Someone lifted Samuel from my arms with gentle authority, and suddenly the room was full of people and equipment and controlled chaos. "What's happening?" David asked, his voice high with panic. "What's wrong with him?" No one answered because they were too busy trying to save our son's life. I watched from my hospital bed, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything but pray the most desperate prayers I'd ever prayed. "Please, God, please, not this, not him, please." For 47 minutes, they worked. 47 minutes of CPR and medications and procedures I didn't understand but could feel in my bones were last resorts. 47 minutes of hope and terror cycling through my chest like alternating currents. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. "I'm so sorry," the doctor said, his voice gentle but final. "We did everything we could. Drop a heart if you know what it feels like to have your world change in an instant." The silence that followed those words was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the comfortable quiet of a sleeping house or the peaceful hush of falling snow, but the terrible silence that comes when life itself holds its breath in shock. I opened my mouth to scream, to rage, to demand explanations from God or the doctor or anyone who might have answers. But nothing came out. Not a sound. Not a whisper. Not even a breath that could carry the weight of what I was feeling. It was as if my voice had been buried along with my son, as if the part of me that knew how to speak to heaven had died in that delivery room, along with every dream I'd carried for 9 months. David wept. The nurses wept. Even the doctor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But I sat in that terrible silence, holding Samuel's still form, trying to understand how someone could exist and not exist in the space of a single breath. "Would you like some time alone with him?" the nurse asked softly. I nodded because words were impossible, because my throat felt like it was full of broken glass, because speaking would have required believing this was real, and I wasn't ready for that kind of faith. They left us alone, David and me and Samuel, the family we'd been for less than an hour, the family we'd dreamed of being for the rest of our lives. David held my hand while I held our son, and we sat in silence because there were no words in any language for what we were experiencing. "He's so beautiful," David whispered eventually, his voice thick with tears. "Look at his hands. Look at his face. He's perfect." I wanted to agree. Wanted to tell him how much Samuel looked like him. Wanted to whisper all the things I'd planned to say during those first precious moments. But when I opened my mouth, only silence came out, not the peaceful silence of contentment, but the hollow silence of something essential being torn away. What I didn't know was that the silence filling that hospital room was about to follow me home, seep into my prayers, and make me question everything I'd ever believed about God's goodness. The hours that followed were a blur of paperwork and decisions no parent should ever have to make. Funeral arrangements for someone who'd never had a birthday, choosing a casket smaller than the hope chest I'd been filling with baby clothes, calling family members to tell them that the celebration they'd been planning would become a memorial instead. Through it all, I remained silent, not by choice, but because my voice seemed to have forgotten its purpose. People spoke to me, doctors explaining medical terms I didn't want to understand, family members offering comfort I couldn't receive, friends promising that God had a plan I couldn't see. "You have to stay strong," my mother said as she helped me pack the baby things we'd brought to the hospital. "Samuel is with Jesus now. He's in a better place." I stared at her, trying to form words around the anger that rose in my throat like bile. Better than my arms, better than the nursery David had painted soft green, better than the life we'd prepared for him with such careful love. But the words wouldn't come. They sat in my chest like stones, too heavy to lift, too sharp to swallow. "God has a plan," the hospital chaplain said when he came to pray with us. "We may not understand it now, but we have to trust that he knows what he's doing." I wanted to ask him where God's plan had been when my son's heart stopped beating. I wanted to know why divine will looked so much like random cruelty. I wanted to demand answers from the God I'd trusted with my most precious gift. Instead, I nodded silently and let him pray over us while I sat in the deafening quiet of my own disbelief. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The car seat we'd installed so carefully the week before sat empty in the back, and every mile felt like moving further away from the last place Samuel had been alive. "We don't have to go in," David said as we pulled into our driveway. "We could stay somewhere else tonight." But where could we go that wouldn't remind us of what we'd lost? The house was full of Samuel's presence, the nursery we'd painted together, the crib my father had assembled with such pride, the mobile that played lullabies we'd chosen with such hope. I shook my head and got out of the car, walking toward a house that no longer felt like home. The nursery door was closed, but I could feel the emptiness behind it, like a physical presence. David had already called his brother to come remove the most painful reminders: the bassinet from our bedroom, the bouncy seat from the living room, the high chair that had been waiting in the kitchen. "I kept the important things," he said quietly. "The books you wanted to read to him, the blanket your grandmother made, the rocking chair." I nodded because speaking still felt impossible, because every word seemed to require more strength than I possessed. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to David's quiet crying and feeling like a stranger in my own life. For months, I'd been talking to Samuel, singing to him, telling him about the world he was going to enter. Now the silence was so complete, it felt like suffocation. I tried to pray, not the desperate bargaining prayers from the hospital, but the kind of simple communication with God I'd practiced since childhood. "Help me," I whispered into the darkness. "I don't understand. I don't know what to do." But the words felt flat, hollow, like they weren't traveling any higher than the bedroom ceiling. It was as if the connection I'd always taken for granted had been severed along with my son's life, leaving me stranded in a silence that felt more like abandonment than peace. Would you still believe if everything was taken from you, even the voice to cry for help? The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and tried to practice speaking, not because I had anything important to say, but because I was starting to worry that my voice might be gone forever. "Hello?" I whispered to my reflection, but the word came out cracked and strange, like it belonged to someone else. "I'm Sarah," I tried next, but even my own name felt foreign in my mouth. The woman looking back at me from the mirror was a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, wearing grief like a second skin. She looked like someone who'd forgotten how to pray, how to hope, how to believe in a God who would allow such senseless loss. But more than that, she looked like someone who'd lost more than a child. She'd lost her voice, her faith, her ability to reach toward heaven with anything more substantial than silence. I spent the morning sitting in Samuel's room, surrounded by everything we'd prepared for him, the books I'd planned to read, the clothes he'd never wear, the toys that would never know the touch of his small hands. The silence felt different here, heavier somehow, weighted with possibility that would never be realized. Friends began arriving around noon, bringing casseroles and condolences and the kind of well-meaning comfort that felt like sandpaper against raw skin. "He's in a better place," they said. "God needed another angel. Everything happens for a reason. You'll see him again someday." I smiled and nodded because it was easier than explaining that their words felt like violence, that their certainty about God's plan made me want to scream if I could remember how to make sound. By evening, when the last visitor had left and David had fallen into exhausted sleep beside me, I found myself alone with the silence that had become my constant companion. I opened my mouth to pray, to rage, to ask God why he'd let me love someone I was destined to lose. But only silence came out, not the peaceful quiet of meditation, but the hollow silence of a broken connection, a severed line between earth and heaven. "Where were you?" I finally managed to whisper, the words scraping against my throat like broken glass. "Where were you when he needed you? Where were you when I needed you?" The silence that answered was so complete it felt like mockery. That night, I learned that there are different kinds of faith. There's the faith that sings and testifies and raises hands in worship. There's the faith that questions and struggles but keeps reaching toward light. And then there's the faith that goes silent, not from lack of belief, but from pain so deep that words become impossible. I was entering the third kind, though I didn't know it yet. I thought I was losing God. I didn't realize I was about to discover him in places I'd never known to look, in the spaces between words, in the ache that had no language, in the silence that would become its own form of prayer. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was the sound of my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Even that felt like too much noise for a world that had just become so much smaller, so much more fragile, so much less safe than I'd ever imagined it could be. Tomorrow would bring the funeral preparations, the decisions about flowers and music and words that someone else would have to speak because my voice had gone into hiding along with my hope. But tonight, there was only silence and the terrible recognition that I was about to learn things about grief and faith and the mysterious ways God meets us in our brokenness that I'd never wanted to know. The cradle in the corner caught the moonlight streaming through the window, its emptiness a physical presence in the room. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, trying to reconcile the love that had prepared it with the loss that had made it unnecessary. Somewhere in that space between love and loss, between hope and devastation, between the voice I'd lost and the silence I was learning to inhabit, something was beginning that I wouldn't recognize for months. The slow work of discovering that God's presence doesn't depend on our ability to speak to Him, that His love doesn't require our words, and that sometimes the most profound prayers are the ones that never find language at all. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that my baby was gone, my voice was buried, and the God I'd trusted with my most precious gift felt as absent as the child who would never sleep in the cradle that caught the moonlight like tears. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. Romans 8:26. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday, which gave us 3 days to pretend we knew how to plan a goodbye for someone who was supposed to have a lifetime of hellos. I sat at our kitchen table while David made phone calls, watching him navigate conversations I couldn't bear to hear. "Yes, the smallest casket you have," he said into the phone, his voice breaking on the word smallest. "Oh, white, I think. Sarah, do you want white?" I nodded because it was easier than explaining that the color of Samuel's casket felt like the least important decision in a world that had suddenly become meaningless. What did it matter if we chose white or blue or soft yellow when the only thing that mattered, our son's heartbeat, was gone forever? The silence that had claimed my voice in the hospital had followed me home like a faithful dog, settling into every corner of our house until even the spaces between words felt heavy with unspoken grief. The doorbell had been ringing constantly since we'd returned from the hospital. Friends bringing meals we couldn't eat, family members offering help we couldn't accept, church members promising to pray prayers I couldn't echo. Each visitor meant well, but their voices felt like intrusions into the sacred quiet of our loss. "You need to eat something," my sister said, setting a casserole on the counter beside 6 others that would eventually spoil untouched. "You need to keep your strength up." I stared at her, trying to form words around the question that had been burning in my chest. Strength for what? What was I supposed to be strong for now that the only person I'd wanted to be strong for was gone? But the words wouldn't come, so I nodded and smiled, the empty smile I was learning to wear like a mask. If you've ever needed to go silent, not out of rebellion, but out of pain too deep for language, you understand what happened to my voice in those first days after Samuel died. By the 3rd day, I'd stopped answering the phone altogether. The sound of it ringing felt like violence against the quiet that had become my only comfort. David fielded the calls, relatives asking about flower arrangements, the pastor wanting to discuss the service, friends checking to see how we were holding up. How were we holding up? The question itself felt absurd. We weren't holding up. We were drowning in slow motion, learning to breathe underwater in a world that no longer made sense. "The pastor wants to meet with us," David said after hanging up from yet another call, "to talk about the service, what we'd like him to say." I opened my mouth to respond, but only air came out. What could anyone say about a life that had lasted less than 5 minutes? What words could possibly contain the love we'd carried for 9 months, the dreams that had died with his first and last breath? David sat down beside me at the table, his own eyes red with exhaustion and grief. "I know you can't talk right now," he said gently. I know it's impossible, but we have to make some decisions." I reached for the notepad we kept by the phone and wrote, "You decide. I trust you." It was the first time I'd communicated anything substantial since the hospital, and the words looked strange on paper, like they belonged to someone else entirely. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since childhood. I hid. While David met with the pastor, I retreated to Samuel's nursery and closed the door behind me, surrounding myself with the only silence that felt safe. The room still smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. The mobile above the empty crib moved gently in the air from the heating vent, playing a lullaby that seemed obscene in its cheerfulness. I reached up and stilled it with my hand, grateful when the music stopped. I sat in the rocking chair we'd bought at an antique store, imagining all the nights I'd planned to spend here nursing Samuel back to sleep, singing him the songs my grandmother had sung to me. The chair creaked softly as I rocked, and even that small sound felt too loud in the sacred quiet of my grief. It was there, in that chair surrounded by everything we'd prepared for a life that would never be lived, that I first tried to pray again. Not the desperate bargaining of the hospital, but the simple reaching toward God that had once been as natural as breathing. "I don't understand," I whispered to the empty room, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I don't understand why you let this happen." The words felt rusty, unused, like a language I was forgetting how to speak, but they were honest in a way that the smiles and nods I'd been offering everyone else weren't. "I trusted you," I continued, my voice growing slightly stronger. "I prayed for him every day. I thanked you for him. I believed you were giving him to us." The silence that answered felt different from the hollow quiet of the hospital. Not empty, exactly, but waiting. As if God was listening to my broken words and holding space for all the ones I couldn't yet say. I pulled up my phone and did something I'd been avoiding. I looked at the photos we'd taken in those brief moments when Samuel was alive. His tiny face, so peaceful and perfect, his hands no bigger than my thumb. The expression of wonder on David's face as he touched his son's cheek. The tears came then, finally, silently streaming down my face as I stared at the evidence that he had been real, that our love for him hadn't been imaginary, that those 4 minutes and 37 seconds had contained an entire lifetime of hope and joy and dreams. You too may have felt the need to go silent when the pain became too much for ordinary language, when regular prayers felt too small for the size of your hurt. The next few days passed in a blur of decisions made by other people. David chose the flowers, white roses, because they were simple and pure. My mother selected the burial outfit, a christening gown that would serve as both first and last formal wear. The pastor wrote the eulogy based on stories David shared about our dreams for Samuel, our hopes for his future, the love that had filled our home even before he arrived. I participated in none of these decisions, not from lack of caring, but from complete overwhelm. Every choice felt simultaneously crucial and meaningless. What did it matter what flowers we chose when Samuel would never see them? What did it matter what songs we sang when he would never hear them? The morning of the funeral, I woke up to find my voice had disappeared entirely. Not just the reluctance to speak that had plagued me for days, but actual physical inability to make sound. David found me in the bathroom, gesturing frantically at my throat, panic in my eyes. "Your voice is gone," he asked, and I nodded. He held me while I cried soundless tears, both of us understanding that this wasn't a medical emergency, but a spiritual one. My body was simply refusing to participate in a world that required words for experiences that had no language. "It's okay," he whispered into my hair. "You don't have to speak today. You don't have to do anything but be there." The funeral home was filled with people I recognized but couldn't really see through the haze of grief. Faces blurred together into a sea of sympathy. Voices murmured condolences that sounded like distant ocean waves. I moved through it all like a sleepwalker, guided by David's gentle hand on my back. When it came time for the service, I sat in the front row staring at the impossibly small casket, trying to comprehend that my son was inside it. The pastor spoke beautifully about eternal life and God's greater plan, but his words felt like they were coming from another planet, another reality where such explanations made sense. People took turns sharing memories they didn't have, hopes they'd carried for our family, promises that Samuel's brief life had meaning. I appreciated their love, but I couldn't access it through the thick wall of silence that surrounded me like protective armor. The only moment that broke through was when my grandmother, now 93 and barely able to walk, made her way to the front of the chapel. Instead of speaking, she began to hum. An old hymn I remembered from childhood, wordless and haunting and somehow perfect for a goodbye that had no adequate words. For the first time since the hospital, I felt something stir in my chest. Not healing exactly, but recognition. Here was someone who understood that some things were too sacred for speech, that some love was too deep for language, that some grief required the music that exists in the spaces between words. I found myself humming along, my voice a broken whisper that couldn't carry a tune but somehow carried my heart. It was the first sound I'd made intentionally in days, and though it was barely audible, it felt like the beginning of finding my way back to something resembling communication with both God and the world. After the burial, after the reception where people ate sandwiches and shared stories about other babies they'd known who died too soon, after the last casserole had been delivered and the last sympathy card had been read, David and I found ourselves alone in our house with our grief. The silence was different now, not the shocked quiet of sudden loss, but the settling quiet of people learning to live in a world that would never again contain the person they'd loved most. It felt permanent in a way that terrified me, as if I might never again find words adequate for the size of what I was feeling. That night, I tried something I hadn't attempted since childhood. I opened my journal and tried to write to God instead of speaking to him. If my voice couldn't reach heaven, maybe my pen could. I don't know what to say to you, I wrote, my handwriting shaky and unfamiliar. I don't know how to pray when prayer feels like talking to empty air. I don't know how to trust you when trusting you with Samuel ended with a funeral. The words looked stark on the white page, more honest than anything I'd been able to speak aloud. I stared at them for a long time, wondering if God could read the handwriting of a broken heart, if he could understand the language of confusion and anger and desperate love. I miss him, I continued writing. I miss the sound of his heartbeat from the ultrasounds. I miss feeling him move inside me. I miss the future we were supposed to have together. I miss believing that love was enough to keep the people we love safe. Page after page, I poured out everything I couldn't say, everything that had been building up behind the dam of my silence. Questions without answers, anger without targets, love without an object to hold. When I finally stopped writing, my hand was cramping and my cheeks were wet with tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. But something felt different, not better exactly, but less trapped, as if the words on paper had created space in my chest for something other than the crushing weight of unspoken grief. I closed the journal and placed it on my nightstand, next to the baby book I'd started filling out during pregnancy and would never complete. Tomorrow, I thought, maybe I would try to write to Samuel. Maybe I would tell him about the grandfather who'd been so excited to teach him to fish, about the aunt who'd already bought him his first baseball glove, about the parents who would love him forever, even though forever had been much shorter than we'd planned. But tonight, I was simply grateful that words had found their way back to me in some form, even if my voice was still hidden somewhere too deep for me to reach. Have you ever needed God to understand a prayer you didn't know how to say? Have you ever felt that the only honest communication with heaven was silence itself? 3 weeks after the funeral, I discovered that grief has seasons, and I was entering the one where numbness gives way to raw, unfiltered pain. The initial shock had worn off, leaving behind something much harder to navigate, the ordinary moments that were supposed to include Samuel, but didn't. Waking up without middle-of-the-night feedings, walking past the nursery without stopping to check on him, the absence of purpose that comes when the person you were preparing to care for is suddenly, permanently gone. My voice had returned in whispers and fragments, like a radio station coming in and out of range. I could speak when absolutely necessary. Yes, no thank you. But anything beyond that felt like speaking a foreign language I was slowly forgetting how to pronounce. David had returned to work, not because he was ready, but because sitting in our quiet house together was making us both feel like we were suffocating in our shared grief. He needed the distraction of normal responsibilities. I needed him to need something other than me to be okay. That left me alone with the silence and the journal that had become my most honest companion. Every morning, I sat in Samuel's room with a cup of coffee that grew cold while I wrote letters to God, to Samuel, to the woman I used to be who believed that faith meant having answers instead of questions. The writing came easier each day, as if my pen was remembering how to speak truths my voice still couldn't manage. I dreamed about you last night, I wrote to Samuel one morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after he died. You were older, maybe 2 or 3, running through a field I've never seen but somehow recognized. You turned and waved at me, and I could hear you laughing. When I woke up, I couldn't decide if it was a gift or torture. The dreams had started a few days earlier, not the nightmares I'd expected, but tender, impossible moments where Samuel was alive and growing and everything our life might have been. I'd wake from them feeling both comforted and devastated, grateful for the time with him even if it was only in sleep. I don't know if you can hear me, I continued writing. I don't know if heaven has visiting hours for mothers who miss their babies. But I'm going to keep talking to you anyway, because the alternative, accepting that you're completely gone, feels impossible. It was during one of these morning writing sessions that I first heard it, the sound of humming coming from somewhere in the house. I stopped writing and listened, thinking David had come home early or that a neighbor was in their yard. But the house was empty, and the humming was coming from inside, soft and melodic and hauntingly familiar. It was the lullaby from Samuel's Mobile, the one I'd silenced the day after the funeral because its cheerfulness felt obscene in the face of our loss. But now it was playing again, not from the mobile. I could see it was still and silent, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't locate but could feel in my chest. I followed the sound down the hallway, my heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. Was I losing my mind? Was grief finally pushing me past the edge of reality into some kind of psychological break? But the humming continued, gentle and persistent, until I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the devotional book my mother had left on the counter weeks ago. I'd been avoiding it along with all the other well-meaning spiritual offerings people had brought, but now it seemed to be calling to me. I opened it randomly and found myself reading Romans 8:26. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. The humming stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, pregnant with meaning I couldn't yet understand but could feel settling into my bones like recognition. Wordless groans. The Spirit interceding when we didn't know how to pray. I read the verse again, then a third time, each reading opening something in my chest that had been sealed shut since the hospital. This wasn't just a Bible verse. It was a description of every prayer I'd tried to pray since Samuel died, every moment I'd sat in his room aching toward God without knowing what to ask for. You hear the groaning, I whispered to the empty kitchen, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. You hear what I can't say. It was the first time since the hospital that speaking to God felt like actual communication rather than talking to myself in an empty room. That afternoon, something shifted. I found myself humming while I folded laundry, not consciously but automatically, the way people do when they're content. It shocked me so much I stopped mid-note, wondering how it was possible to feel anything resembling peace in a world that no longer contained my son. But the humming had felt natural, like breathing or blinking. My voice was finding its way back to me through music rather than words, melody rather than language. I thought about my grandmother at the funeral, how her wordless hymn had been the only thing that felt honest and true in a day full of explanations that explained nothing. Maybe this was how communication with God was supposed to work when regular prayer felt impossible, not through perfect words or theological understanding, but through the music that lives in the spaces between thoughts. That evening, David came home to find me in the kitchen actually cooking dinner instead of staring at the casseroles people had brought. It was nothing elaborate, just spaghetti and a salad, but it was the first time since Samuel's death that I'd done something purely out of care for someone else. You're humming, he said, surprise and hope mixing in his voice. I stopped, suddenly self-conscious. I didn't realize. Don't stop, he said quickly. It's the first time this house has felt alive since we came home from the hospital. We ate dinner to the sound of my tentative humming, both of us afraid to comment on the fragile normalcy of sharing a meal we'd both helped prepare. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was something other than drowning, which felt like progress. That night, I did something I hadn't done since before Samuel was born. I took a bath. Not the quick utilitarian showers I'd been managing, but an actual bath with candles and the lavender oil my sister had given me months ago, for after the baby comes. As I sank into the warm water, I felt my body relax for the first time in weeks. The constant tension I'd been carrying, in my shoulders, my jaw, my chest, began to ease, and with it came something unexpected. Gratitude, not gratitude for Samuel's death, which still felt senseless and wrong, but gratitude for the 4 minutes and 37 seconds we'd had together. Gratitude that I'd been chosen to be his mother, even if only briefly. Gratitude that love had existed between us, pure and perfect and unbreakable, even if our time had been cut impossibly short. The tears that came weren't the desperate, choking sobs of the early days, but something gentler, the kind of crying that feels like rain after drought, necessary and cleansing and somehow healing. "Thank you," I whispered into the candlelit bathroom, not sure if I was talking to God or Samuel or the universe in general. "Thank you for letting me love him. Thank you for letting me be his mother." The words surprised me with their honesty. Despite everything, the loss, the anger, the feeling that God had abandoned us in our greatest need, underneath it all was this bedrock truth. I was grateful to have been Samuel's mother, even if mothering him had meant letting him go almost immediately. There's a kind of healing that doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like breathing again after forgetting how. The next Sunday, I did something that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I went to church. Not because I was ready to sing hymns or shake hands during the peace or pretend that my faith had been restored to its pre-loss simplicity, but because something in me was hungry for corporate silence, for being in a room full of people who were also reaching toward God, even if my reaching looked different from theirs. David held my hand as we walked into the sanctuary, both of us hyper-aware of how different we looked, how grief had aged us, how loss had changed the shape of our faces. People smiled at us with the careful compassion reserved for the walking wounded, and I appreciated their gentleness, even as I couldn't quite receive their comfort. I didn't sing during the worship songs. The words felt too certain, too triumphant for where I was spiritually. But I listened, and in the listening found something I hadn't expected, permission to be exactly where I was instead of where I thought I should be. When the pastor stood to read the morning scripture, I felt my breath catch. Romans 8:26. The same verse from the devotional, the same words that had accompanied the mysterious humming in my kitchen. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. He began to speak about the difference between prayers of words and prayers of the heart, about how God hears what we cannot say and understands what we cannot articulate. It was as if he was speaking directly to me, directly to the wordless ache I'd been carrying for weeks. "Sometimes," he said, "the most honest prayer is the one that has no words. Sometimes the deepest communion with God happens in the silence, where we simply show up and let him hold our pain." I started crying then, not the silent tears I'd grown accustomed to, but audible weeping that I couldn't control or hide. David wrapped his arms around me while I sobbed into his shoulder, and for the first time since the hospital, I didn't feel ashamed of my tears. Around us, the congregation continued singing, but several people near us were crying too, moved by their own losses, their own wordless prayers, their own need to believe that God heard what they couldn't say. In that moment, surrounded by other broken people reaching toward the same God I'd been struggling to trust, I understood something profound. I wasn't alone in my silence. There were others who'd lost children, marriages, dreams, faith itself, who were also learning to pray without words, to worship without certainty, to believe without understanding. The service ended with communion, which I'd planned to skip. How could I take the bread and wine when I wasn't sure I believed in the God who offered them? But as the elements were passed, something in me whispered that this was exactly when I most needed to receive grace, not when I was strong enough to deserve it, but when I was too weak to earn it. I took the bread and wine with shaking hands, and as I swallowed, I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless for weeks. Not answers. I still had no answers. But presence. The quiet, steady presence of a God who had been there all along, even when I couldn't feel him, even when I couldn't speak to him, even when I doubted his goodness. After church, a woman I barely knew approached me in the parking lot. She was older, maybe 70, with kind eyes and the sort of face that looked like it had seen its share of sorrow. "I lost a baby too," she said simply. 43 years ago. It doesn't stop hurting, but it does change. The silence you're in right now, it's sacred. Don't let anyone rush you out of it." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in the parking lot with tears streaming down my face and the strangest sense that God had just spoken to me through a complete stranger. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since before Samuel's death. I called my sister. "Sarah?" she answered, surprise and relief evident in her voice. "How are you?" It was such a simple question, but it was the first time someone had asked without immediately following up with platitudes about God's plan or reminders about heavenly reunions. She just asked how I was and waited for my answer. "I'm sad," I said, my voice clearer than it had been in weeks. "I'm sad and confused and sometimes angry, but I don't know how to explain it. I'm also grateful. Is that crazy?" "No," she said softly. "It's not crazy. Love makes us grateful, even when it breaks our hearts." We talked for an hour, the first real conversation I'd had since the hospital. I told her about the humming, about the verse that kept appearing, about the woman in the parking lot who'd given me permission to stay in the silence as long as I needed. "It sounds like God is meeting you exactly where you are," she said, "not where you think you should be, but where you actually are." That night, I sat in Samuel's room with my journal and wrote something I hadn't been able to articulate before. I think I'm learning a new language, not the language of answers or explanations, but the language of presence. The language that says, "I'm here," instead of "I understand." The language that groans when words fail and hums when silence gets too heavy. Maybe this is what Romans 8:26 means, that the Spirit doesn't just pray for us when we can't pray. Maybe the Spirit teaches us that wordless groaning is itself a form of prayer, that humming can be worship, that silence can be sacred. I don't know if I'll ever understand why you took Samuel so quickly, but I'm starting to understand that you never took your presence away from me, even when I couldn't feel it. You were in the silence, translating my wordless pain into prayers I didn't know I was praying. What if the Spirit is praying for you right now, in the places you forgot how to feel, in the silence where words have failed, in the humming that comes from somewhere deeper than conscious thought? As I closed the journal and prepared for bed, I realized something had shifted over the past few weeks. Not everything. I was still heartbroken, still confused, still learning how to live in a world without Samuel. But the crushing sense of God's absence had been replaced by something quieter and more sustainable. The recognition that presence and understanding were different things, that being held and being healed weren't the same process. God had never left me in that hospital room. He'd never abandoned me in the silence that followed. He'd been there in the wordless groaning, in the tears that had no language, in the love that persisted even when hope felt impossible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments when the grief would feel too big for my body to contain. But tonight, for the first time since Samuel's death, I fell asleep to the sound of my own humming, wordless melodies that somehow carried more truth than any prayer I'd ever spoken aloud. The Spirit was interceding for me through music I didn't remember learning, melodies that seemed to come from the same place where love and loss intersect, where silence and presence dance together in the sacred space between heartbeats. And for now, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 6 weeks after Samuel's death, I did something that surprised even me. I signed up for a grief support group, not because I was ready to share my story with strangers, or because I thought talking about loss would somehow diminish it, but because the woman in the church parking lot had planted a seed when she told me about losing her baby 43 years ago. If she could survive that kind of loss and still have the grace to comfort someone else walking the same path, maybe there was something to be learned from people who'd been in this darkness longer than I had. The meetings were held Thursday evenings in the basement of a community center, in a circle of folding chairs that had probably witnessed more tears than most churches. When I walked in that first night, I was struck by how ordinary everyone looked, not like people who'd been shattered by loss, but like neighbors you'd see at the grocery store or parents picking up kids from school. "Welcome," said the facilitator, a woman named Margaret who'd lost her teenage son in a car accident 5 years earlier. "We're glad you're here, even though none of us wants to be." The gentle honesty of that statement, acknowledging that no one chooses to need a grief support group, made me feel safer than any platitude about healing could have. I spent that first meeting mostly listening, amazed by the variety of losses represented in our small circle. There was Robert, whose wife of 38 years had died of cancer. Linda, whose adult daughter had taken her own life. James, whose baby girl had been stillborn at 36 weeks. Maria, whose husband had died suddenly of a heart attack at 42. Each story was devastating in its own way, but what struck me most wasn't the pain. It was the way these people talked about their losses, not with the desperate edge of fresh grief, but with something that looked almost like acceptance. Not acceptance that their loved ones were gone, but acceptance that they could carry that reality without being destroyed by it. Grief, Margaret said during that first meeting, isn't something you get over. It's something you grow around, like a tree growing around a fence post. The fence post never goes away, but the tree learns to incorporate it into its growth. When it came time for introductions, I opened my mouth to share Samuel's story and found that my voice was steady, clear in a way it hadn't been since the hospital. "I'm Sarah," I said. "My son Samuel died the day he was born, 6 weeks ago. I've been having trouble talking to God, to people, to anyone, but I'm here because I think I'm ready to try again." The circle received my words with the kind of silence that feels like acceptance rather than judgment. No one rushed to fill the quiet with explanations or comfort. They just let my truth exist in the space between us, held by people who understood that some truths are too big for immediate response. After the meeting, a woman named Claire approached me. She was maybe 50 with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held both deep sadness and surprising peace. "I lost my son when he was 3 days old," she said simply. "That was 8 years ago. Would you like to get coffee sometime?" I nodded, surprised by how much I wanted to say yes. For weeks I'd been avoiding the well-meaning friends who wanted to help me get back to normal. But here was someone who understood that there was no going back, only growing forward around the permanent reality of loss. We met the following Tuesday at a cafe near my house. Claire ordered chamomile tea, and I got coffee I barely touched, and we sat across from each other like women who'd survived the same war and were comparing scars. "Everyone wants to know when you'll be better," she said after I'd told her about the endless stream of visitors asking how I was holding up. As if grief has an expiration date, as if love has a statute of limitations. "Yes," I said, relief flooding through me at being understood. "And they want me to find meaning in it, or lessons, or silver linings, but some things just are what they are, terrible and senseless and permanent." Claire smiled. The first smile I'd seen from someone talking about child loss that didn't look forced. "I stopped believing in answers," she said. "I started trusting presence instead." The words hit me like recognition. "What do you mean?" "I used to think faith meant having explanations for everything, understanding God's plan, being able to make sense of suffering, having the right words for every situation. But when Luke died, all of that fell apart. I couldn't explain why God would let a 3-day-old baby die. I couldn't find meaning in watching my child struggle for every breath and then stop breathing altogether." She paused to sip her tea, choosing her words carefully. But what I discovered in that falling apart was something I'd never noticed before. God's presence doesn't depend on my understanding. He was there in the NICU during those 3 terrible days. He was there when I held Luke's body after he died. He was there in the silence when I couldn't pray and the darkness when I couldn't hope. "How do you know?" I asked. "How can you be sure he was there when it felt like he was absent?" Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring into her tea as if the answer might be floating there among the chamomile flowers. "Because I survived," she said finally. "Not just physically, but spiritually. The faith that got destroyed wasn't my real faith. It was my assumptions about faith. What was left after everything fell apart was something much simpler and much stronger. The knowledge that I was being held, even when I couldn't feel the arms that were holding me. I thought about Romans 8:26, the verse that had been following me for weeks. Do you think God hears prayers we don't know how to pray? I think, Claire said, that God hears everything. The prayers we speak, the prayers we write, the prayers we hum without realizing we're humming. But most of all, I think he hears the prayers of our presence, just showing up to our own lives when showing up feels impossible. That afternoon, I went home and did something I'd been putting off for weeks. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice breathless with hope and anxiety. "Sarah? How are you? I've been so worried. You haven't been returning my calls." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I haven't known what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she said, her voice softening. "I just needed to hear your voice, to know you're still there." Still there. Such simple words, but they captured something essential about survival after loss. Not thriving, not healing completely, not being better. Just still being there, still breathing, still taking up space in a world that had fundamentally changed. We talked for 30 minutes about nothing important. The weather, her garden, David's work, the casseroles she wanted to bring over. Normal conversation that felt revolutionary after weeks of silence. When we hung up, I realized I'd been smiling, actually smiling, for the first time since the hospital. That evening, David came home to find me in Samuel's room, but not crying this time. I was sitting in the rocking chair, reading aloud from one of the children's books we'd bought for our son. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice curious rather than concerned. "Reading to him," I said simply. "I know it sounds crazy, but I spent 9 months talking to him, singing to him, reading to him. I don't want to stop just because he's not here in the way I expected him to be." David sat down on the floor beside the rocking chair and listened while I finished the story, a simple tale about a little bear who gets lost but finds his way home. When I closed the book, he was crying quietly. "I miss him too," he said. "I miss the conversations we'll never have, the stories I'll never read to him, the person he would have become." "I know," I said, reaching down to touch his hair. "But maybe we can still love him, even if we can't hold him. Maybe love doesn't require physical presence to be real." It was the first theological statement I'd made since Samuel's death that felt true instead of obligatory. Love persisting beyond physical presence. Love as the thing that remains when everything else has been taken away. The next Thursday, at Grief Group, Margaret asked us to share something we'd learned about ourselves in the past week. "I learned that I can still pray," I said when it was my turn. "Not the way I used to, with words and requests and expectations, but I can still reach toward God, even when I don't understand Him, even when I'm angry with Him." "What does that look like?" asked James, the man whose daughter had been stillborn. I thought for a moment, trying to find words for experiences that felt too fragile for language. "Sometimes it's humming while I fold laundry. Sometimes it's sitting in my son's room and just being there with the love I still carry for him. Sometimes it's reading stories aloud to someone who can't hear them, but might somehow still receive them." I paused, surprised by my own clarity. I think prayer might be less about the words we say and more about the love we carry. Less about getting answers and more about staying connected to the source of all love, even when that source feels mysterious or distant or even cruel. After the meeting, Robert, the man who'd lost his wife, came up to me. "You're learning something it took me 3 years to figure out," he said. "That faith isn't about having God make sense. It's about trusting that somehow, in ways we can't see, we're still held by love itself." That night, I did something I hadn't done since before Samuel was born. I prayed out loud. Not a complicated prayer, not a theological statement, not a request for explanations or miracles. Just 3 words, spoken into the darkness of our bedroom while David slept beside me. "Just stay close." The words surprised me with their simplicity, their honesty, their complete lack of pretense. I wasn't asking God to fix anything or explain anything or change anything. I was just asking Him to stay close while I learned how to live in a world that would always contain this loss. "Just stay close," I repeated, and the words felt like the most honest prayer I'd ever prayed. There's a kind of healing that doesn't look like being fixed. It looks like learning to live with beautiful scars, like discovering that broken things can still hold love, like finding out that some questions don't need answers. They just need to be held by someone who's big enough to contain them. Over the following weeks, my voice continued to return in small increments. Not all at once, not with the confident certainty it had held before Samuel's death, but gradually, like dawn breaking slowly over a landscape that would never look the same but could still be beautiful. I started calling David during his lunch breaks, just to tell him I loved him. I began responding to the friends who'd been patiently texting me for weeks, not with explanations of where I'd been, but with simple acknowledgments of their care. I even answered when my sister called, letting her hear my voice speaking words of love and gratitude instead of just silence. But most importantly, I started talking to Samuel again, not just writing in my journal, but speaking aloud to him during my morning coffee, while I watered the plants he'd never see, as I looked at the stars he'd never wish upon. "I wish you were here," I told him one evening, standing in his room as the sun set through the window. "I wish I could hold you and sing to you and watch you discover the world. But since you can't be here in the way I planned, I'm going to love you in the way that's possible. I'm going to carry you with me, talk to you, read to you, and trust that love finds a way to bridge whatever distance exists between us." The words felt like vows, not the wedding vows I'd spoken to David, but something equally sacred. A commitment to ongoing love despite impossible circumstances, to relationship that transcends physical presence, to faith that operates without requiring understanding. 2 months after Samuel's death, Claire invited me to attend a special service at her church, a memorial service for babies who had died. I almost said no, afraid it would be too painful, afraid I wasn't ready for that kind of public acknowledgement of loss. But something in me whispered that it was time, that I was ready to be in community with other parents who understood that love and loss could coexist, that grief could be both devastating and sacred. The service was beautiful in its simplicity. Parents read the names of their children who had died, some as babies, some as children, some as adults. After each name, the congregation responded with, "Beloved child of God," and a candle was lit. When it was my turn, I stood up on shaking legs and said, "Samuel David Thompson, beloved son, beloved child of God." As the candle was lit for my son, I felt something I hadn't expected, not just sadness, but gratitude. Gratitude that his name had been spoken in a room full of people who understood that even the briefest lives have profound significance. Gratitude that his existence had been acknowledged, celebrated, honored. After the service, I realized that I'd found something I'd been searching for without knowing it. A way to be Samuel's mother in a world where he wasn't physically present. A way to love him, honor him, carry him with me without being destroyed by his absence. God doesn't need perfect words. He hears the soul's ache, the love that persists beyond explanation, the faith that chooses trust over understanding. That night, I sat in Samuel's room with my journal and wrote my first letter to God in 2 months that didn't begin with a question or a complaint. "Thank you for giving me the privilege of being Samuel's mother, even if only briefly. Thank you for the love that connected us before I ever saw his face. Thank you for the way that love continues, transformed but not diminished by his physical absence. I don't understand why he couldn't stay. I may never understand that. But I'm beginning to understand that love doesn't require understanding to be real. As I closed the journal and prepared for bed, I realized that somewhere in the past few months, without my noticing, my faith had been quietly reconstructing itself. Not returning to what it was before, that simple answer-focused faith had been permanently altered by loss, but growing into something deeper and more sustainable. Faith that could hold questions without needing to resolve them, love that could persist without requiring explanation, trust that could coexist with mystery. Romans 8:26 had become more than a verse I'd found at the right moment. It had become the foundation of a new understanding of prayer, of communication with God, of what it meant to be heard and held by love itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments when the grief would feel overwhelming. But tonight, I fell asleep with the quiet confidence that God had been listening all along, to my spoken prayers and my silent tears, to my angry questions and my wordless humming, to the love that connected me to Samuel and the faith that connected me to the one who held us both. The Spirit had been interceding for me through every wordless groan, every sleepless night, every moment when love felt too big for language. And somehow, in ways I was only beginning to understand, that had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything I needed to learn how to speak again without needing answers, how to love without requiring explanation, how to trust in presence rather than understanding. And that, I was discovering, was a kind of miracle all its own. 3 years after Samuel's death, I stood in front of a church congregation and did something that would have been impossible in those first weeks of silence. I told them about learning to hear God in the quiet places. It wasn't something I'd planned. The pastor had asked if I'd be willing to speak during their annual service for families who'd experienced loss, and my immediate instinct was to say no. Who was I to offer comfort to others when I still missed my son with an ache that could take my breath away on ordinary Tuesday afternoons? But David had encouraged me, and Claire had reminded me that sometimes the best ministry comes not from having overcome something completely, but from having learned to live beautifully within it. So I found myself standing at a podium, looking out at faces that reflected my own journey, the hollow eyes of fresh grief, the tired expressions of long-term sorrow, the quiet strength of those who'd found ways to carry their losses without being destroyed by them. I want to tell you about the day I lost my voice, I began, my words steady in a way that would have shocked the woman who couldn't speak at her own son's funeral, and how I discovered that sometimes God hears us most clearly when we've forgotten how to make sound. I told them about Samuel, about the 4 minutes and 37 seconds that had contained a lifetime of love, about the silence that had followed his death like a faithful shadow, about the Romans 8:26 verse that had found me when I needed it most. For months, I said, I thought my silence meant I'd lost my faith. I thought the fact that I couldn't pray meant God had stopped listening. But what I learned was that the Spirit had been praying for me all along, translating my wordless grief into languages only heaven could understand. I spoke about the grief support group, about Claire's wisdom that presence mattered more than understanding, about learning to read stories aloud to a son who couldn't hear them, but somehow still received them. The voice I lost wasn't really gone, I continued. It was being restored slowly. One whispered prayer at a time, one hummed lullaby at a time, one honest conversation with God about how broken everything felt. As I looked out at the congregation, I saw tears on faces, nods of recognition, the kind of listening that happens when someone speaks truths you've carried alone for too long. I'm not standing here to tell you that your grief will disappear, or that your questions will all be answered, I said near the end. I'm here to tell you that God never left you in your silence. He was there in the wordless groaning, in the tears that had no language, in the love that persisted even when hope felt impossible. After the service, people lingered, not to offer me the kind of empty comfort I'd received in those early days, but to share their own stories of silent seasons, of prayers that had no words, of faith that had been broken down and slowly rebuilt into something stronger and more honest. A young father, whose teenage son had died in a car accident, told me he'd been afraid to come to church because he couldn't sing the happy songs anymore. An elderly woman, whose husband of 50 years had died of Alzheimer's, said she'd been worried that her angry prayers weren't holy enough for God to hear. A middle-aged woman who'd miscarried twins shared that she'd been convinced her grief was too small to matter in the grand scheme of suffering. Your pain matters, I told each of them, all of it. The big losses and the small ones, the dramatic griefs and the quiet sorrows. God has room for all of it. That night, David and I drove home in comfortable silence, both of us processing the evening's conversations. Finally, he spoke. I'm proud of you, he said simply. 3 years ago, you couldn't speak Samuel's name without breaking. Tonight, you helped other people find their voices by sharing how you found yours. I thought about his words as we pulled into our driveway, past the garden where I'd planted a small memorial rosebush for Samuel, past the front porch where we'd learned to sit together in our grief without trying to fix each other. I think, I said slowly, I finally understand what Claire meant about not losing our children, just loving them differently. That weekend, I did something that had become an annual tradition. I spent Samuel's birthday in his room, not mourning what wasn't, but celebrating what had been and what continued to be. The room had changed over the years. The crib was gone, donated to a pregnancy center where it could serve families who needed it. But the rocking chair remained, and the bookshelf full of stories I'd never stopped reading aloud, and the window that caught the morning light in a way that always made me think of hope. I sat in the chair with my journal, not the grief journal of those early months, but a new one I'd started a year ago, dedicated to letters to Samuel about the life I was living and the love I was carrying for him. Happy 3rd birthday, sweet boy, I wrote. I wonder what you would have looked like today, whether you'd have David's stubborn cowlick or my tendency to talk to myself when I'm thinking. I wonder if you'd have loved books the way I do, or if you'd have been more interested in trucks and dirt and adventure. I paused in my writing, listening to the sounds of Saturday morning around me, David mowing the lawn, children playing in the neighbor's yard, the distant sound of church bells marking the passage of time in a world that had learned to include Samuel's absence without being defined by it. But here's what I've learned about wonder, I continued. It doesn't require answers to be beautiful. I can wonder about who you would have become while also celebrating who you were in those 4 minutes we had together. I can miss the future we didn't get while still being grateful for the love that connects us across whatever distance exists between earth and heaven. I told him about the church service, about the people who'd found comfort in our story, about the way his brief life continued to create ripples of healing in places I'd never expected. Your life mattered, I wrote, not because of what you might have accomplished, but because you were loved completely, and because that love changed me in ways that continue to change others. You made me a mother. Even though mothering you looks different than I planned, you taught me about faith that doesn't require understanding, about prayers that don't need words, about the way love persists beyond physical presence. After I finished writing, I did something else that had become tradition. I read aloud from the book of stories I'd been collecting for 3 years, not just children's books, but stories of hope I'd found in unexpected places, testimonies from other parents who'd learned to carry loss without being buried by it, scripture verses that had revealed new meanings in the context of grief. Romans 8:26, I read aloud. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. The verse that had once felt like a lifeline now felt like a foundation. Not just something that had helped me survive the crisis of fresh grief, but something that continued to inform how I understood communication with God, how I prayed for others who couldn't find words, how I trusted in presence when explanations weren't available. That afternoon, Claire came over for our monthly visit. These conversations had become precious to both of us, two mothers learning together how to love children we couldn't hold, how to find purpose in pain we wouldn't have chosen. "How was the church service?" she asked as we sat in my garden, drinking tea beside Samuel's rosebush. "Healing," I said, "for them and for me. There's something powerful about saying out loud that God hears what we can't speak. People need permission to believe that their silence isn't abandonment." Claire nodded, understanding in the way that only comes from walking the same difficult path. "I've been thinking about something you said once, that you'd learn to be Samuel's mother in a world where he wasn't physically present. I think that might be the most important thing anyone could learn about love." "What do you mean?" "That love isn't dependent on circumstances. That relationship can persist beyond physical presence. That mothering, or any kind of loving, is about carrying someone in your heart, not just in your arms." Her words settled into me like recognition. This was what I'd been learning without realizing I was learning it, that the love I felt for Samuel wasn't diminished by his absence, that my identity as his mother wasn't invalidated by his death, that the relationship we'd begun in those 4 minutes could continue in forms I'd never imagined. "I used to think losing Samuel meant losing my chance to be a mother," I said. "But I think I'm actually a mother in the deepest possible way, loving without being able to protect, caring without being able to control, trusting someone precious to God's care rather than my own." That evening, David found me in Samuel's room, sitting by the window as the sun set. He joined me on the floor, his back against the wall, both of us comfortable in the silence that had once felt like suffocation, but now felt like sanctuary. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if Samuel had lived?" he asked. It was a question we'd asked ourselves countless times in the early days, usually with devastating longing, imagining the parallel universe where our son grew up healthy and strong. But tonight, the question felt different, curious rather than tormented. "I think about it," I said, "but not with the same desperation I used to. I think we would have been happy in that life, but we would have been different people. We wouldn't have learned what we've learned about faith and grief, and the way love can persist beyond explanation. Do you think we're better people because of what we've been through?" I considered the question seriously. Were we better? Certainly we were different, more aware of fragility, more grateful for ordinary moments, more comfortable with unanswered questions. I think we're more real people, I said finally. More honest about how little we control, more amazed by grace when we receive it, more aware that every day with the people we love is a gift we don't deserve. And more willing to sit with other people in their silence, David added. Yes, that too. 6 months later, I received a phone call that would confirm something I'd been sensing for a while. My experience with Samuel and the aftermath was meant to be shared more widely. We'd like you to consider writing a book, the voice on the other end said. It was an editor from a Christian publishing house who'd heard me speak at a conference. About faith in the silence, about prayer without words, about how God meets us in our wordless grief. My first instinct was to say no. Who was I to write about faith when mine had been so thoroughly shattered and slowly rebuilt? Who was I to offer guidance when I still had days when the grief caught me off guard and left me breathless? But as I sat with the possibility over the following weeks, I kept thinking about all the people who'd approached me after speaking engagements, who'd written emails after reading articles I'd published, who'd found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their silent seasons. I think, I told David one evening, I'm supposed to write about this, not because I have all the answers, but because I've learned to live with the questions. The book took me 2 years to write, partly because I was still learning the truths I was trying to share, partly because some stories can only be told slowly with reverence for their sacred weight. I called it Wordless Groans, Finding God in the Silence of Grief, and dedicated it to Samuel and to all the parents who love children they cannot hold. The response surprised me. Letters from people who'd lost children, spouses, parents, dreams, messages from those who'd experienced depression, spiritual dryness, seasons when prayer felt impossible. Emails from pastors who'd never known how to minister to people in silent seasons, from counselors who wanted to understand the spiritual dimensions of wordless grief. Thank you for giving me permission to stop trying to pray pretty prayers, one woman wrote. Thank you for showing me that God heard my angry silence. Your book helped me understand that my son's 3-day life had profound meaning, wrote another mother. That brief doesn't mean insignificant. I've been a pastor for 20 years, wrote a minister from Oregon, and I never understood that some people need to worship in silence until I read your chapter on wordless prayers. You've changed how I think about ministry to the grieving. But the letter that moved me most came from a woman in Texas whose baby had died at 32 weeks. I read your book in the NICU while my daughter was dying, she wrote. When she took her last breath, I didn't try to find words to pray. I just hummed to her the way you wrote about humming to Samuel. It felt like the most honest prayer I'd ever prayed. Thank you for teaching me that love is its own language. 5 years after Samuel's death, I was invited to speak at a conference for pregnancy and infant loss awareness. As I stood backstage preparing to address an audience of several hundred people who'd walked similar paths, I felt Samuel's presence with me in a way that no longer surprised me, but still moved me deeply. Help me say what they need to hear, I whispered, not to the empty air, but to the God who'd proven himself faithful in ways I'd never expected, through means I'd never imagined. The talk went well, but it was the conversation afterward that stayed with me. A young woman, maybe 25, approached me with tears in her eyes. I lost my baby 2 months ago, she said. I haven't been able to pray since then. I thought it meant I'd lost my faith. Have you been able to love your baby? I asked. She looked confused. Of course, I love her more than anything. Then you haven't lost your faith, I said gently. Love that persists beyond explanation, beyond understanding, beyond physical presence. That is faith. That love you carry for your daughter, that's prayer. That ache in your chest when you think about her, that's worship. The Spirit is translating all of it into languages only heaven understands. Her face changed as she absorbed this, hope replacing despair in her expression. Really, really. Your silence isn't abandonment, it's sacred. God hears every wordless prayer, every unspoken plea, every breath you take while carrying love too big for language. As I watched her walk away with lighter steps, I realized something profound. Samuel's brief life had created a ministry I never could have planned, had given me authority to speak into pain I wouldn't have chosen, had made me useful to God in ways I couldn't have imagined during those first dark months of silence. Are you willing to believe He was always holding you, even when you felt most alone? That night, in my hotel room, I sat with my journal and wrote a letter to Samuel that felt different from all the others. 5 years ago today, I thought losing you meant losing everything that mattered. I thought my inability to speak meant God had stopped listening. I thought silence was the opposite of faith. But you taught me something beautiful, my son, that love doesn't require words to be real, that faith doesn't need explanations to be authentic, that God's presence doesn't depend on our ability to feel it or speak about it. You made me a mother in the deepest possible way, not someone who controls and protects, but someone who loves completely and releases fearlessly, trusting you to the care of the one who loves you even more than I do. Your life, all 4 minutes and 37 seconds of it, has touched more hearts than you'll ever know. The book I wrote about learning to love you in silence has helped thousands of people find their voices again. The ministry that grew from our story has created safe spaces for people to grieve honestly and love fearlessly. I still miss you. I always will. But I no longer think of missing you as a problem to be solved or a pain to be healed. I think of it as evidence of a love so profound it transcends physical presence, so real it needs no confirmation beyond its own persistence. Thank you for teaching me that some of the most important conversations happen in silence, that the deepest prayers have no words, that God hears everything, especially what we cannot say. The next morning, I flew home to David, to the life we'd built that included Samuel's absence without being defined by it, to the ministry that had grown from our willingness to be broken together and healed slowly. But first, I made one more stop. I drove to the cemetery where Samuel was buried, to the small headstone that read simply, Samuel David Thompson, beloved son, 4 minutes of perfect love. I sat beside his grave in the morning sunshine and did what had become my practice whenever I visited. I read aloud from the latest stories I'd collected of people finding faith in silence, hope in wordlessness, God's presence in the darkest places of loss. Listen to this one, I said, pulling out a letter from a father whose stillborn daughter had died 3 years earlier. He writes, Your book helped me understand that the songs I hum while I rock in her empty nursery are prayers, that the tears I cry when no one's watching are worship, that the love I carry for her isn't grief, it's faith. I read him several more letters, sharing stories of people who'd learned what we'd learned, that God's presence doesn't depend on our circumstances, that love persists beyond physical separation, that sometimes the most honest prayer is wordless, groaning that the Spirit translates into languages only heaven can understand. When I finished reading, I sat in the peaceful quiet of the cemetery, surrounded by evidence of other lives that had been briefer than expected, but no less significant. Other loves that had persisted beyond physical presence. Romans 8:26, I said aloud, the verse that had become the foundation of everything I believed about prayer, about faith, about God's faithfulness in our silent seasons. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. I never really lost what mattered most, I continued, speaking both to Samuel and to myself. I never lost you, because love doesn't end with death. I never lost my voice, because silence can be its own language. I never lost God's presence, because presence doesn't depend on my ability to feel it. What I found instead was something deeper than I'd ever known. Faith that could hold questions without needing answers, love that could persist without requiring explanation, hope that could coexist with loss. As I stood to leave, I felt the same sense of gratitude that had surprised me in that bathtub 3 years earlier. Not gratitude for Samuel's death, which remained senseless and heartbreaking, but gratitude for having been chosen to be his mother, for the love that had connected us before I ever saw his face, for the way that brief love had expanded into something that touched countless other lives. The drive home was peaceful, filled with the kind of silence that had once felt like absence, but now felt like presence. Samuel's presence, God's presence, the presence of love that transcends physical form and speaks in languages the heart understands even when the mind cannot. At home, David was working in the garden, tending the vegetables we grew each summer and the flowers we planted in memory of the son who'd made us parents for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. "How was your visit?" he asked, looking up from the tomato plants with soil on his hands and peace in his eyes. "Good," I said, meaning it in the deepest possible way. "Really good." That evening, we sat on our front porch as the sun set, holding hands in comfortable silence, both of us aware that this ordinary moment, this quiet evening, this simple togetherness, was a gift we'd learned not to take for granted. The silence around us wasn't empty. It was full of Samuel's presence, of God's faithfulness, of love that had proven itself stronger than death, deeper than explanation, more persistent than pain. And in that fullness, that sacred quiet where words weren't necessary and understanding wasn't required, I knew with absolute certainty that I had never really lost what mattered most. I'd lost my son's physical presence. I'd lost my simple faith that bad things don't happen to people who love God. I'd lost my ability to pray with confident words and certain expectations. But I had never lost Samuel's love. I'd never lost God's presence. I'd never lost the connection that binds hearts together, across any distance, any circumstance, any form of separation this world can create. The Spirit had been interceding for me all along, translating my wordless groans into prayers only heaven could hear, carrying my love to places I couldn't reach, holding me with arms I couldn't feel but could somehow trust. And that persistent presence, that faithful love, that divine translation of human pain into heavenly understanding, was everything. More than everything. It was the foundation on which everything else could be rebuilt, the anchor that held firm when everything else was swept away, the truth that remained when all other certainties had crumbled. I had learned to speak again without needing answers. I had learned to love without requiring explanations. I had learned to trust in presence rather than understanding. And most miraculously of all, I had learned that the voice I thought I'd lost in that hospital room hadn't been lost at all. It had simply been transformed into something deeper, more honest, more real than any voice I'd ever possessed before. A voice that could speak comfort to others walking in darkness, a voice that could translate silence into hope, a voice that could testify to God's faithfulness even in the midst of unexplainable loss. Samuel's voice, speaking through mine. God's voice, speaking through the both of us. Love's voice, speaking languages that bridge every separation and heal every silence and hold every broken heart in the certainty that nothing, not death, not distance, not the failure of words themselves, can separate us from the love that holds all things together. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. Romans 8:26. If you've ever carried grief too deep for language, know this: He still heard you. When your faith went quiet, when your prayers became sighs, and when your heart could only whisper through tears, the Spirit translated every ache. You're not alone. You're not abandoned. And even in silence, heaven was listening. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, I want you to consider this. What if the silence you've been carrying isn't evidence of God's absence, but proof of His presence in places too sacred for words? What if the prayers you think you've never learned to pray have been flowing from your heart all along, in your sighs, in your tears, in the love you carry for people you can no longer hold? What if the voice you think you've lost was never really gone, just being transformed into something deeper, more honest, more real than any voice you've ever possessed before? Cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. 1 Peter 5:7. The God who numbered every hair on your head also numbers every tear you've cried, every breath you've taken while carrying pain too big for language, every moment you've felt alone in your silent struggle. He hears the prayers you whisper in the dark. He hears the songs you hum without thinking. He hears the love you carry for people who are no longer here to receive it. Most of all, he hears your heart, not just the words it forms, but the love it holds, the faith it carries, the hope it dares to nurture even in the midst of devastating loss. Your silence is not abandonment. Your wordlessness is not weakness. Your inability to find language for your pain is not evidence that you've been forgotten. It's proof that some experiences are too sacred for ordinary words, that some love is too deep for everyday language, that some prayers can only be translated by the Spirit who understands what we cannot say. Before you sleep tonight, know this: you are heard. You are held. You are never alone, even in the quietest corners of your grief, even in the darkest seasons of your doubt, even in the silence where words fail and only love remains. The Spirit is interceding for you right now, in this moment, in this breath, in this quiet space where your heart meets His heart and language becomes unnecessary because love speaks its own eternal tongue. Rest now, knowing that you are perfectly understood by the one who hears every wordless groan and translates them into prayers more beautiful than any language could contain. Sleep in the peace of knowing that your silence is sacred, your love is eternal, and your voice, whether whispered or sung, spoken or hummed, will never be lost as long as it comes from a heart that dares to keep loving, even when love requires letting go. He will not grow tired or weary, and His understanding no one can fathom. Isaiah 40:28. Some conversations happen in silence, some prayers have no words, and sometimes the most profound communion with God occurs not when we have all the answers, but when we finally stop needing them and rest in the certainty that we are known, loved, and held by the one who understands every language of the heart. Sweet dreams, beloved. You are heard, you are held, and in your silence, heaven is listening.